In ancient Rome, family was sacred. The household was not merely a private unit of domestic life. It was the foundation of Roman society, the core from which law, honor, and tradition extended outward. At its head stood the paterfamilias, the father, who held absolute authority over his household. He could arrange marriages, dictate livelihoods, and even decide questions of life and death within the family. To the Romans, the father was not simply a parent, but a figure tied to divine and civic order itself. So what crime could possibly be considered so vile, so corrupt, that it tore at the very heart of this sacred order? It was parricide, the act of killing one's father, mother, or close kin. In Roman thought, parricide was not merely murder, it was the destruction of the sacred chain that connected the individual to their ancestors, their gods, and ultimately to Rome itself. To kill a parent was to sever one's link to life, heritage, and honor. It was an act that unmade the very fabric of society. For such a crime, the Romans believed that ordinary punishment was not enough. A murderer could be executed by the sword, crucified, or thrown to beasts. But a parricide demanded something darker, something that mirrored the unnatural horror of the crime itself. From this belief emerged one of history's most bizarre and terrifying punishments, Poena Cullei, the penalty of the sack. The ritual was carefully staged to strip the condemned of their humanity before death. First, the guilty person was flogged until their body bore the marks of shame. Then, their head was covered with a wolf's hide, or sometimes the skin of another beast, symbolizing that they were no longer a human being but something wild, unnatural, and cursed. Stripped of identity, they were no longer considered a man or woman of Rome, but a creature unworthy of society. Next came the most horrifying stage. The condemned was sewn into a heavy leather sack, the cullus. But they were not alone. Alongside them, executioners placed a collection of live animals: a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. The choice of creatures was deliberate, each carrying symbolic meaning in Roman thought. The dog represented loyalty turned against the master. The monkey stood for mockery and unnaturalness. The snake embodied treachery and death. The rooster, a creature of dawn, symbolized the perversion of life's natural cycles. Together, these animals created a chaotic, frenzied nightmare inside the sack. Imagine the terror, confined in suffocating darkness, trapped in a thrashing bag with claws, teeth, and scales scraping against your body, the animals panicking and striking in blind frenzy. The condemned had no escape. And then, as if this living tomb was not enough, the sack was carried to a river or sea and hurled into the water. The weight of the leather dragged it down. Water seeped in, air thinned. The animals flailed in their own panic. Death came by drowning, suffocation, or the bites of terrified beasts. To the Romans, this execution was not only a punishment, but a ritual curse. The parricide was denied even the dignity of a grave. By sealing them in a sack and casting them into water, the state symbolically erased them from the community of the living and the dead. No burial meant no peace in the afterlife. The guilty soul was left rootless, cut off from ancestors, gods, and Rome itself. The origins of Poena Cullei reach deep into the Republic. One of the earliest references comes from the 12 Tables, the legendary foundation of Roman law written in the mid-5th century B.C. Though the details of the punishment varied across centuries, its essence remained consistent. The crime of parricide demanded not just death, but obliteration. Over time, the spectacle grew more elaborate. By the late Republic and into the Empire, writers like Cicero and later jurists recorded the fully developed ritual with its infamous collection of animals. Each execution served as a grim reminder of Rome's values: loyalty to family, obedience to authority, and the horror reserved for those who betrayed them. But how often was Poena Cullei actually carried out? Surviving records suggest it was rare, and for good reason. Parricide itself was a rare crime, given Rome's deep reverence for family bonds. Yet its rarity only made the punishment more terrifying. The mere existence of the sack was enough to remind Romans of the sacred duty they owed their parents. It was less a common practice than a looming threat, a nightmare whispered about in courts and forums. One of the most notorious cases occurred during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century A.D. A slave was accused of murdering his master, who in Roman law could be considered a paterfamilias. Though debates raged about whether a slave could truly commit parricide, the penalty of the sack was imposed. Ancient historians recount how the condemned was sewn up with animals and cast into the sea, a demonstration of the empire's unbending cruelty toward anyone who broke sacred order. The ritual, however, was not without its critics. Some Roman writers questioned whether the punishment was excessively brutal, more a spectacle of cruelty than a deterrent. Yet others defended it fiercely, insisting that no ordinary death could match the gravity of parricide. For them, Poena Cullei was justice made flesh, a punishment as unnatural as the crime it condemned. Still, as centuries passed, the practice began to fade. By the late Empire, it appeared less frequently, overshadowed by the rise of Christianity and changing views on punishment and the afterlife. Yet it never disappeared entirely. Legal codes of the Byzantine Empire still preserved the memory of the sack, echoing the old Roman terror even as society transformed. The horror of Poena Cullei lies not only in its physical cruelty, but in its symbolism. It was designed to humiliate, to strip away humanity, to deny family, community, and burial. It was not only death, but erasure. The condemned was transformed into a monster, sewn into a sack with beasts, and cast into oblivion. And while centuries have passed, the image still chills the imagination. The leather sack sinking beneath the water, thrashing with claws, and screams until silence swallows it whole. The memory of Poena Cullei has lingered for centuries, not because it was common, but because it was unforgettable. Unlike the swift strike of an axe or the slow agony of crucifixion, the sack represented a punishment uniquely tailored to its crime. Rome wanted the world to know that the betrayal of one's parents was a wound so deep, so unnatural, that only an execution outside the bounds of ordinary death could answer it. Every stage of the ritual reinforced that message. The flogging stripped away dignity. The wolf's hide masked the condemned as a beast. The sack separated them from the human world. And the river, the final resting place, denied them any connection to land, family, or afterlife. It was a punishment that reached beyond the body into the soul, cutting ties not just with life, but with memory. The animals themselves became part of this dark theater. Ancient jurists debated their meanings, but most agreed that each was a symbol of broken bonds and inverted nature. The dog, man's most loyal companion, became a reminder of betrayed trust. The monkey, an image of distorted humanity, mocked the condemned as unnatural. The snake, a creature of poison and treachery, mirrored the crime itself. The rooster, tied to cycles of time and dawn, was said to represent the parricide's twisted defiance of natural order. Together they created chaos inside the sack, an echo of the chaos unleashed by the murderer's betrayal. One can imagine the fear among spectators as they watched such a sack carried through the streets, the crowd silent or jeering before it was hurled into the river, no blood spilled, no sword raised, yet the horror was absolute. The punishment was not designed only for the condemned. It was designed for the audience. It was theater of terror, a ritual of control. And yet the Romans believed this cruelty was necessary. In their view, law was not only about justice, but about preserving the sacred order of the world. Without respect for parents, without loyalty to the paterfamilias, society would collapse into chaos. Thus, Poena Cullei was less about vengeance than about preserving Rome itself. As the empire shifted, the punishment evolved. By the late empire, some accounts mention only a sack and drowning, with the animals omitted. Others recorded variations in the creatures included. In some cases, only snakes or dogs were used. The ritual may have grown more symbolic and less practical, yet its essence remained the same. The parricide must die in a way that erased them from the human community. When Christianity rose to dominance, attitudes toward punishment began to change. Mercy and the possibility of forgiveness crept into law. Still, the sack survived in legal codes well into the Byzantine period, preserved as a memory of Rome's ancient ferocity. Even centuries later, jurists cited it as the ultimate penalty for the ultimate crime. To modernize Poena Cullei seems almost unthinkable, more like a grotesque legend than a legal sentence. Yet it was very real. What makes it so chilling is not only its brutality, but its precision. Every detail was symbolic, every stage carefully crafted to send a message. It was an execution designed not only to kill, but to annihilate identity, to turn the parricide into a living curse before drowning them in silence. The punishment reveals the darkest side of Roman order, the belief that cruelty was justified if it preserved the state. Rome prided itself on law and civilization, but beneath that pride lay punishments that stripped people of humanity in the name of protecting society. Even now, the story of Poena Cullei forces us to ask, how far will a civilization go to preserve its values? How much cruelty can be justified in the name of order? And how many punishments, once thought necessary, now stand as reminders of the terrible power of fear and tradition? The sack, sewn tight and hurled into the river, reminds us of the cost of a society built on absolute control. It shows us that justice, when twisted by fear and symbolism, can become darker than the crime itself. And yet it also explains why Rome lasted so long. By making punishments unforgettable, by terrifying would-be criminals with visions of beasts in a sinking sack, Rome kept order through fear as much as through law. More than 2,000 years later, the image still lingers. The condemned thrashing inside the sack, animals clawing and snapping in panic, the water closing over them as the last air is forced out. The silence that follows is the silence Rome demanded, not only of the parricide, but of anyone who dared defy family, order, or state. Poena Cullei remains one of history's most nightmarish punishments, a mixture of ritual, symbolism, and cruelty that reveals just how far the Romans were willing to go to defend their values. It is a reminder that justice, in the hands of power, can become as terrifying as the crimes it seeks to punish. If this story sent chills down your spine and you want to uncover more about humanity's starkest punishments, subscribe to Torture's Rooms. From burning stakes to crushing stones, from iron grills to leather sacks, we bring you the executions that history tried to bury. Because behind every punishment lies a truth. Power rules not only with law, but with fear.